I think this whole notion that capitalism cannot really resolve its own contradictions, as you said, is just plain to see right now. And that the notion that capitalism can just develop to its final stage and then we everywhere and then we get socialism, right? This kind of a very orthodox way of looking at revolution. It, first of all, doesn't exist in the real world, and second of all, what we're seeing now with the Ukraine crisis is that global capitalism led by the United States doesn't have the capacity to even manage a situation like the Ukraine crisis fully to its own benefit. I mean, if we think about, as you said, the gas continuing to flow, that's an acknowledgement by capital itself that if Russian gas is turned off in a major way in Europe, then there's going to be a worldwide economic crisis with Europe at the center. And the United States continuing to pump oil from Russia, even if it's a lesser degree, is an acknowledgement that there will be a worldwide economic crisis if that is fully stopped. So there are these extreme limitations that I think shows how connected the world has become. This whole the whole sort of idea of globalization has reached uh, its most, I think, acute phase. And pluripolarity seems to be this expression of how there are various responses to this globalization. And Russia is a very unique, I think, a case because Russia has had the experience. I mean, Russia and a lot of Eastern Europe had the experience of the Soviet Union and socialism, the socialist bloc, and they had the experience of neoliberal shock therapy right after that, and now has the experience of being kind of caught in this world order that is designed to uphold U.S. hegemony, but U.S. hegemony can't really hold itself up. So Russia is kind of in the middle of all of that, navigating it in its own way. And a lot of people are confused by that because Russia is a very complex place because a lot of people don't understand the Soviet Union. So how could they understand the history of the Soviet Union, the reality of what happened after its fall? So how could they understand how Russia is governed and why Russia is doing what it's doing in the Ukraine crisis or in any other
Absolutely.
situation, issue, policy? You can't understand it if you don't understand that the U.S. hegemony can hold itself up and is kind of trying to export all of the consequences of that. It's trying to level that on the entire planet, but it just keeps blowing back. It's and that's the contradiction. That's the interconnect. I feel like that's the connection between um uh yeah, these contradictions is that there's this kind of like a feedback loop happening for the United States. The longer they try to pursue this hegemony, the more the what Marx would call the graveyard of capitalism, it grows bigger and bigger,
Yes.
and it's almost like the system is just back is backing up as it tries to move forward.
Exactly. I mean, I would say also that, if you think about the fact that what capitalism requires from the rest of the world they need to have markets, they need to invest their surpluses somewhere, and of course they need labor force, and they need resources. And essentially, by going to war with much of with Russia, and but with much of the rest of the world siding with Russia, the capitalist world's ability to access these things itself is being eroded. And it's no wonder, therefore, that important sections of the European elite and even the American elite are basically saying, this is not the way to go. We've got to put a stop to this, because at the end of the day, what are they going to do without access to cheap resources, etc., etc.? So absolutely, I think this is definitely definitely what's going back. And speaking of sanctions blowback, of course, we haven't even talked about this, but as some of you may know already, what's going on right now is that the United States, by freezing Russia's central bank assets, has really dealt a death blow to the dollar system for a number of reasons. I mean, it was the United. This is not the first time the United States has essentially stolen a country's money. It has done that before to Venezuela, for example, and Iran, and so on, and Iraq as well, by the way, and of course Afghanistan. Right now everybody wants to cry crocodile tears over the humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan, but in fact one of the major parts of the solution to that crisis is actually to release the reserves that the Americans are keeping and threatening to give to Afghanistan's enemies, actually. So the United States has done this before, but it has never done it to a country of the size and significance, systemic significance of Russia. Russia is not a tiny economy. It may not be the biggest, but it's not tiny. Moreover, Russia is home to some of the most critical supplies of energy, minerals, and even agricultural production. So in that sense, by sequestering, by freezing Russia's central bank reserves, essentially the United States has told the world that its financial system is like a completely unreliable bank. Imagine if you were, if you discovered that your bank had essentially taken away the money of your friend who also banks there, and essentially told your friend that they cannot have access to their own money, would you continue banking with that bank? This is the key thing. And by the way, this is not a sudden turning point. The faith in and the faith in and attractions of the American financial system, which forms the basis of the dollar, was being undermined even before the present crisis, even before the war over Ukraine, and so on. And if you think about it, one very simple indication of how serious this crisis is to just look at the Federal Reserve's balance sheet. If you Google Federal Reserve balance sheet, you should be able to find a chart that shows you how before 2008, the Federal Reserve's balance sheet had assets of about $1 trillion. Between 2000, in the years immediately after 2008, it went up to about $4 trillion, and it then kind of stabilized. And just before the pandemic, it was beginning to sort of taper just a tiny bit. But once the pandemic came along, it shot up to more than twice as much, to over 9 trillion. What is all this money? What are all these assets? This is a measure of the extent to which the Federal Reserve has had to pump money into the asset markets, whose attractiveness keeps people demanding dollars and therefore keeping up its value. But essentially today, the dollar's value is completely artificial, thanks to the upward pressure on it that the Federal Reserve's own activities have been putting. So in that sense, the sanctions blowback is very considerable, and the severity of this problem can be seen if we consider the fact that, when the United States came along, as I describe in my book, early in the 20th century, the United States business and policy-making elites could see that Britain was no longer sort of dominating the world economy, not even dominating the world financial system and commercial system. So they basically felt that they would like, since British dominance was fading, that they would replace this with some kind of American dominance. And essentially, the history of American foreign policy since then has been a history of trying to establish this dominance. It was never successful, but it has never stopped trying. Now, if you can, and so they wanted to establish this sort of dominance. But of course, the British dominance relied on the biggest empire the world had ever seen in history, the empire on which the sun never set. The United States had no hope in hell, in a world of competing empires, in a world of rising nationalism, etc., to establish such an entity. So they said, okay, we won't get to have an empire, but we will try to create a dollar system. We will try to make the dollar the world's money. Well, what they forgot is that the only reason sterling had served as world's money is because, in a relatively stable fashion, even that was not entirely stable, but insofar as it was totally reliant on Britain's ability to squeeze surpluses out of her formal colonies like British India, like British colonies in Africa and the Caribbean, etc. Without this ability, the British sterling would not have performed the role that it did for a while, for a relatively short while, if you think about it. And as a consequence, as I also show in my book, the dollar has never succeeded. It did not succeed. Then it led to the breaking of the link to gold. And since that time, since 1971, it has relied on the financializations that have cost the world so much in terms of financial crises, in terms of increasing inequality, and ultimately in terms of diverting vast quantities of money away from productive investment and into speculation and predatory activities. So this is just some of the ways in which we are looking at a real crunch point. The financial sanctions blowback is going to undermine the dollar system, and it is already being undermined because, quite frankly, other people are already constructing alternatives to them. The Chinese, the Russians, the Indians, and a whole bunch of other countries besides are creating alternative bilateral and multilateral structures to bypass the dollar.